Alfred and Holly were at the police station when their boss left 2 big boxes on their desk. There, they would find the documentation to solve a new case. The detective opened the boxes and looked inside. One box had a lot of documents as well as a journal. The other one was filled with DVDs, photos, and other pieces of evidence which were already taken to the lab and came with their corresponding results. Among the samples were what seemed to be strands of hair, as well as chunks of human skin and flesh. Alfred immediately knew he would be working on one of the most gruesome cases of that year. It was already late, so he decided to take the boxes home and check out their contents more calmly. He said goodbye to Holly and got in his car. When he arrived home, he left the boxes at the entrance and went directly to take a shower. It had been a pretty busy day, and Alfred needed to clear his mind before checking out all the items in the boxes. After showering and having dinner, he emptied the contents of the boxes on his living room table. He saw photographs of different crime scenes and noticed it wasn't a single murder, but 5. He organized the photos by date and saw that all of the bodies had something in common. It's as if someone had tried to eat them. It was very likely they were dealing with a real live cannibal. Alfred started to gag and couldn't avoid rushing to the bathroom to throw up. Despite being one of the most experienced detectives in the area, those pictures really impacted him. But he had no choice. People were still being murdered, and that specific case had been assigned to him. He grabbed one of the photographs and started to examine it. It was a 35-year-old woman. He could only know that thanks to the info card next to the photo, since all that was left of her was a completely mutilated body. Chunks of flesh had been torn out from her and were spread all over her bed. The bed sheets were soaked in blood. Her chest was destroyed, her ribs broken, and her heart had been removed. Her eyes were torn out as well, and some of her fingers were missing. Alfred could barely stand looking at those photos without throwing up again. He decided to put them aside and started reading the journal found at the house of that very victim. In that journal, the woman wrote something on the last page. "I'm still very scared. I don't know how much longer I can endure this. I know that something is observing me. He opens the doors and windows while I'm asleep. I have no peace. I can't stand this anymore. I can't even eat. I went to the police to report him, but they ignored me. They treated me like I'm crazy when all I want is for him to leave me alone." The pages of the journal were blood-stained, as if the victim had been killed right when she was writing. They found the book near her bed next to her corpse. Alfred then read the previous entries in the journal, and all of them talked about the killer. Her words were filled with fear and anxiety. The victim had been tormented for several days. Alfred read the journal from the newest to the oldest entry until he reached the first day when the young woman noticed something strange was happening in her house. "My window is still opening on its own at night. It's so strange. I close it perfectly when I go to sleep, but when I wake up, it's open again. It might be just an animal though. Maybe it's a squirrel that climbs up the tree outside my house. Tonight, I'll leave a camera filming my window, and then I'll try to catch that squirrel." After those words, the next pages in the journal started getting filled with fear and panic. After filming her window that night, the lady was horrified. Who or what did she see? And why didn't anybody help her? Alfred was especially shocked by that case, so he decided it was best to just go to bed for the time being. His head was saturated and he wasn't thinking clearly. He would check out all the items the next morning with his co-worker. The next day, Alfred arrived early at the office, but Holly was already there, waiting for him. Alfred turned on the thermostat and prepared 2 coffees. She asked him about the case. He sighed quietly and opened the boxes to take out the photos of the murders. Holly closed her eyes for a few seconds and gulped. She wondered how anybody could do something so atrocious. Alfred then started to reread the journal entries. First, the day the window started to open on its own, and then next day's entry where she started to panic. His first hypothesis was that a former romantic partner was tormenting her, that he was watching her every night and was breaking into her house. What didn't make sense is how could there be 4 more victims as well? Throughout the day, they kept on reading the documents and checking the images. All of them were so grotesque that they could barely look at them. After checking the samples picked up from the crime scenes, they remembered that they hadn't checked the contents of the DVDs yet. It was pretty late, so Alfred proposed that he would watch them that night and would bring a report for Holly the next day. When Alfred got home, he put on the DVDs in his DVD player to watch it on his TV and sat on his sofa. He was surprised to see that it contained the videos filmed by the same woman with the journal. At first, nothing was happening. All he could see was her shadow on her bed, writing on a notebook that was probably the journal now in his possession. She then got into her bed sheets and fell asleep. The detective sped up the playback of the first hours of the video and stopped when he noticed a different movement. It looked as if someone was climbing the tree next to the window. All he could see was a dark, immobile silhouette on a tree branch. Alfred needed to see that shadow more closely. He ejected the DVD out of his DVD player and put it in his computer's DVD drive. There, he had a specialized software to better analyze those kinds of images. He zoomed into the figure but couldn't distinguish it clearly, but it seemed to be a man. The figure stayed on a tree branch for hours, observing the young lady's room until it was almost dawn. And in that moment, the figure jumped from the tree, making noise and waking up the victim. The detective looked down for a few minutes, pondering, until his stomach reminded him that he hadn't eaten anything the entire day. Thus, he decided to take a break to make dinner. Alfred prepared a couple of steaks with potatoes, and with his stomach full, he went back to the computer and was startled to see that his window was open. He didn't remember opening it. Tried to ignore it, but after watching the victim's video, he started to get nervous. Alfred started to believe that the murderer found out that he had that video footage and that the killer was now coming to get him. His mind started racing with those thoughts, making him feel more and more paranoid. However, he tried to remain calm, closed the window, and kept watching the DVDs. The video of the second night started in the same way. However, the victim placed a candle next to the window, likely to better distinguish who was there, although it wasn't very effective. The lady started writing in her journal again, and when she finished, she left it on her nightstand. She then got into her bed sheets and fell asleep. After a few hours of filming, the murderer appeared at the window again. In that moment, Alfred thought he heard a voice, so he turned up the volume of his headphones to the max and confirmed that the sound was coming from the shadowy man. The man seemed to be muttering something, but Alfred couldn't distinguish what it was. He rechecked the victim's report to see if anyone had identified that voice. However, he found another document that caught his attention even more: the arrest of the young woman's cousin the night of her murder for being the prime suspect. Agents indicated that he called the police pleading for help, declaring that he couldn't get into the lady's room. However, when the police arrived, they found him in her bedroom next to her corpse. During the interrogation, the cousin said that the young woman told him that someone was watching her at night, and that she asked the police for help, but that they didn't send anyone to patrol her house. And so the cousin decided to spend the night with her. However, on the night of the murder, when he heard the screams of his cousin, something was blocking the door and he couldn't save her. It was only when the murder had taken place that the door got unblocked and he could get in. But it was too late. For the very first moment, the cousin was considered the prime suspect since they found him on his knees next to the young lady's corpse. After checking the video footage, he was actually released, but his behavior completely changed. He was diagnosed with severe mental damage, refused to cooperate with the rest of the investigation, and was interned into a psychiatric hospital. And just a few days later, he became the second victim of that murder. Alfred checked the photos of the next crime, and in them he could see the cousin completely quartered. The killer had followed the same patterns: chunks of flesh torn out, no heart, and no eyes. It was very likely that all of the victims were connected. It could be that during each murder there was a witness and the killer wanted to end everyone who could report him. However, it was too soon to jump into conclusions. He started checking the third DVD. The video started with a young lady making sure her window was well closed and leaving another lit candle there. Soon after, her cousin came into the room and gave her a hug. He told her that he would sleep in the next room and asked her to scream if she saw anybody at her window. The young woman then got into bed, looked towards the window, and wrote on her journal for the last time. The detective sped up the playback to reach the moment when the murderer appeared. He kept watching the video, but nothing was happening, until he soon noticed something different and paused the video. Alfred was shaken and his hands were sweating. He was about to witness a horrible scene. The window slowly opened and the shadowy figure got in. He went to the door and blocked it with something. Then he went towards the victim's bed, dragging his feet. He looked at the camera for a few seconds, but the room was way too dark to distinguish his face well. Then the figure slowly leaned towards the lady and muttered something in a quiet but threatening voice. Alfred couldn't understand him. He raised her hair, smelling it thoroughly. That's when she woke up and started screaming. After a few seconds, Alfred could hear how somebody was hitting the door from outside. It was the lady's cousin who was trying to open it to help her. The killer then plunged onto the poor woman to rip her apart. He tore out many chunks of her skin and threw them around the room. He started laughing louder and louder while his victim perished under him. Soon enough, the young woman couldn't struggle any longer. The killer then tore out her heart from her chest and ate it. When he finished, he started eating more of her flesh. He tore out her eyes and chewed on them as if they were gummies. And lastly, he tore out many of her fingers. During all that time, the cousin outside the room wouldn't stop hitting the door and yelling for help. When the shadowy killer finished eating, he then walked towards the camera. His face still couldn't be distinguished well due to the darkness. He spit what seemed to be blood and started cackling in pleasure. He blew the candle the lady had left there, removed whatever was blocking the door, and jumped out the window. Alfred was facing one of the most disturbing cases of his career. That criminal had managed to make him nervous. He decided to go to bed and try to get some rest, although it wasn't going to be easy to sleep without having nightmares about those images. The next day, he woke up with a bad headache and pressure in his chest. But despite the lack of sleep and discomfort, he got dressed and drove to the police station. He knew he had a long, hard day of work. When he arrived, Holly was waiting for him at her desk, with a worried expression that didn't go unnoticed by the man. "Good morning, Alfred. I see you with a bad face." He sighed and sat in his chair, placing the DVD cases he had brought home the day before. He told his partner that the images were much harsher than he had imagined. Seeing that criminal in full action, knowing that it was real, and that it wasn't a movie with actors and special effects, was heartbreaking. My legs were shaking as I watched him tear apart the pieces of that young woman's meat, as if it were a piece of beef on the plate. And from your face, I think you're not going to give me good news about this case. Holly shook her head and picked up a box of new clues in plastic bags from the floor. Then she gestured for her companion to take a look inside. As he did so, the man came across images and evidence that looked frighteningly familiar. It was a new crime by the same murderer. The photos of the remains of the deceased made his skin crawl. They had to find the person responsible as soon as possible. He spent the entire day looking for common links, reviewing the police list of criminals with criminal records with unknown whereabouts. He needed more data. When night came, he told his partner that he was taking the videos home again to review them. When he got home, he grabbed one of the DVDs and inserted it into the player with shaking hands. He carefully observed the first images that appeared on the screen again, writing down in a notebook all the elements that he found relevant. The half-open window, the shadow. When he reached the part where the murderer began his terrible act, tearing the body of the victim, he felt the impulse to stop the video, but he had to watch those images again. It was necessary to find that monster. He clenched his fists tightly, feeling anger and helplessness at the brutality of the crime. When the video came to an end, with the killer fleeing out the window after satisfying his hunger, Alfred stood frozen in front of the screen. He swallowed and realized he needed a moment to process all of this. He remained silent in horror, and suddenly he heard knocking in his house. Full of fear, he took his gun and walked slowly, looking for where the noise was coming from. He checked the kitchen, the bathroom, and finally, his bedroom. He gasped when he saw that the window was open. He perfectly remembered leaving it closed. He turned to grab his cell phone and call for backup. The murderer was waiting for him behind him. Alfred fired, but the creature seemed unfazed. That was not a human. The policeman began to scream desperately, but the murderer gagged him and threw him to the ground. Then he could hear him whisper,
I want you to stay alive, conscious, and not pass out. I want you to be with me while I taste you.
Then he began to tear off the skin from his chest with his bare hands. Alfred screamed with all his might while he felt that his body had become a new menu for that beast. Then he licked his fingers and then tore them off with his teeth. While the police officer felt like he was going to faint from the pain, the killer licked his lips, chewing the flesh off the torn off fingers, leaving only the bone. He seemed to be eating chicken wings, one after another, leaving his fingers clean while the victim bled to death. Then he put his hand into his abdomen, and when he reached his heart, Alfred had already died. The creature took the heart to the kitchen and placed it on a plate. He grabbed a bottle of wine and sat on the couch to eat dinner while watching television. In the background, he could see the pool of blood from Alfred's corpse. The murderer looked at him and wiped the blood running from his mouth with a napkin. He poured some wine into a glass and, savoring it, he imagined his next banquet. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it. And if you want to see more Draw My Life videos, subscribe to our channel. See you in the next episode.